Hello everyone, I'm Afreen and you're watching the South Asia Research Institute for Minorities exclusive interview series. Today we have a very honorable and distinguished guest for an interview, well, with whom I'm really thrilled and delighted to speak. He is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. In addition, he is a professor at the University Faculty of Law, as well as the adjunct professor at the National University of Ireland, Galway. The Human Rights Council nominated him UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, and he began his duties on August 1st, 2017. He has received tributes from Africa, Asia, and Europe, as well as the several prizes in honor of his efforts and achievements in the field of human rights and minority protection. Well, yes, he is a very well-known figure, Dr. Fernand de Varennes. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing fine, and I'm hoping everything is fine with you also in Pakistan.
Yeah, everything is fine, and I'm very pretty well. I think let's begin today's interview in the name of God. Well, my first question is, sir, the United Nations has designated you special rapporteur on minority issues. What are the current projects you are working on, and what actually does its roles entail?
Thank you very much, and once again, also especially thank you for having me here. I'm very pleased to be part of this interview with the South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. I think you're doing very, very important work. As a special rapporteur, immediately after my election by the UN Human Rights Committee, I announced a number of priority themes or areas where I would be focusing. One of them is statelessness, when you have individuals with no citizenship whatsoever. And by the way, more than three quarters of stateless people around the world are people or individuals who belong to various minorities. The other area of priority was the issue of education, language, and minorities. For linguistic minorities, obviously, being able to learn, but also to be taught in their own language is often an important claim that they have in terms of their human rights to quality and equal education. A third thematic priority was the issue of hate speech and social media and minorities. You may know, or perhaps not, that in most countries, the vast majority of the targets for hate speech in social media are in fact minorities. And this is something that needed to be highlighted as part of my mandate. The fourth thematic priority of my mandate is the issue of conflict prevention and the protection of the human rights of minorities. Most of the violent conflicts around the world today are internal conflicts, and in fact, most of them involve minorities, usually minorities that have grievances of exclusion or discrimination within their own country, and quite often because of practices and policies of the government, which disadvantages them or discriminates against them. So those are the four areas that I identified as priorities for my mandate on which we're focusing. We have different activities. And one additional one is the need to have a more regional approach to be able to understand, to speak with and engage with minority experts in different parts of the world, and also to understand the different contexts and challenges in different regions of the world, so that we actually are truly global and not focused mainly in Geneva. If I can just very quickly just add, as a special rapporteur, I actually have a number of hats. One of them is that as an independent expert, which offers, if you will, guidance and studies reports for the United Nations General Assembly and the United Nations Human Rights Committee on specific issues, clarifying some of the main challenges that we have in terms of protecting and recognizing the human rights of minorities. But also one of my main activities is as a special procedure. Individuals and organizations can approach, if you will, submit allegations of violations of their human rights as minorities to me in Geneva, and then we can respond through political and diplomatic channels to try to raise these issues with the government's concerned. So very quickly, those are two of the main activities, if you will, of a special rapporteur.
Oh, well, definitely, sir, you are doing tremendous work. Well, if I'm not wrong, you have published in over 30 languages and have over 200 publications to your credit. Can you please share your research experience with us?
Thank you very much. My work as an academic, I've been a university professor in many parts of the world, as a matter of fact, including Asia, Africa, and Europe. My work has focused on the human rights of minorities throughout my career. A bit more on the area of, if you will, the language rights of minorities, the linguistic rights of minorities as human rights, but also in the area of conflict prevention and using the human rights of minorities as guideposts, indications on how the government should deal with the grievances or demands of minorities in a way that respects their human rights and prevents some of the root causes of many violent conflicts around the world. So those are two of the main areas of my work, as you pointed out, as an academic, as a university professor, who focused on international human rights and the rights of minorities.
Okay, moving forward, what does it mean to protect minorities, especially in the current political climate? What certain political groups say that minorities are a threat to ruler nations?
I think the way to understand it is that there has been, and there still is, I think, some fundamental misunderstandings about what are the rights of minorities. Let me be clear. The rights of minorities are human rights. If we talk about the rights of religious or belief minorities, the main rights of minorities in the area of religion or language are freedom of religion or non-discrimination on the ground of religion or belief, and so on. Could be freedom of expression. Traditionally, or for a long period, it was thought that perhaps the rights of minorities were different. They were a kind of newer types of human rights that were not well established under the United Nations. And some governments believe that these rights are perhaps not as important or well established, and therefore they perhaps hesitated or were not certain as to the content of these rights. Those are misperceptions, misunderstandings. We are talking about fundamental human rights, as I said, often connected to fundamental rights such as freedom of religion, non-discrimination, and so on. And one of my main tasks and one of the big challenges is to actually try to clarify these misunderstandings, to indicate more clearly what are the human rights of minorities in international law in areas such as religion or language, or in some cases, ethnicity and culture.
Okay, Doctor, my next question is related to UN. What else might the UN have done, in your opinion, to protect South Asian persecuted minorities? What do you believe that most pressing issues of South Asian minorities should be addressed in the near future?
Thank you very much. I think, and to be very blunt in a sense, or honest, I think the United Nations needs to do more as an international organization to highlight, better understand, and to better try to focus on the protection of those who are most vulnerable and marginalized in South Asia and in other parts of the world. These are minorities. And I think, unfortunately, for various reasons, many of the entities, the various mechanisms that we have at the United Nations have not focused sufficiently on minorities. One of the big challenges, I think, in many parts of South Asia, including Pakistan, is hate speech. Hate speech in social media against minorities such as the Ahmadi or Dalits or other groups who are ethnic minorities or religious minorities in Pakistan, India, and so on. Hate speech that you find in social media often is focused on these categories of minorities. And however, unfortunately, at the United Nations, many of the instances, the various mechanisms that we have, haven't recognized this, haven't talked about it, hasn't even used the word minority to try to tackle hate speech. Because hate speech does not target everyone in the same way. The main targets are usually minorities, and some of the most vulnerable of these minorities are minority women also, which is something we need to talk about more. This has not been addressed sufficiently, hasn't been identified specifically, because we need to protect those who are most unable to protect themselves. Minority women, minorities in South Asia in particular, in social media. And social media, by the way, is not just words. They are words, hate, that can lead to violence. And I think there's been many instances of violence in various parts of South Asia that have been incited by social media, targeting specifically minorities.
Well, moving forward to the next question, Dr. Fernandin, when we talk about South Asia region, what are your opinion on South Asia's current level of religious freedom? What are some of the common stumbling obstacles in debate between free speech and religious and cultural sensibilities? What can South Asia countries do to reduce the likelihood of conflict?
I think one has to understand that we need to address hate speech, particularly against religious minorities in South Asia, in a way that recognizes and focuses on who are the most vulnerable. Unfortunately, there is a tendency sometimes to look or to deal with hate speech in social media, for example, from the point of view of the majority. And that even criticisms by some minority human rights defenders that not enough is being done, or that, for example, the Ahmadis or the Dalits are victims. We have situations where the laws that are supposed to protect against hate speech, for example, or hate crimes, are used in a perverse way against those who are actually the victims. And so we are saying that human rights defenders that are actually warning that minorities are being targeted are being accused of incitement of division, for example, for criticizing or pointing out that you have some human rights minorities who are actually being targeted and may be attacked or actually marginalized in a different way. This is a very serious problem, but a problem which I think needs a global answer. And what I mean by that is that freedom of speech, you use the expression freedom of speech. We talk about freedom of expression in international human rights law. Freedom of expression must not be used to propagate hate and incitement to violence and discrimination. And therefore, what we need are clear rules, I think, to avoid situations which unfortunately seem to happen quite often in South Asia, situations where certain minorities are actually portrayed as disloyal or dangerous or foreign or others that do not merit the same kind of protection of their human rights. So I suggest that there is a need to clarify what is freedom of expression in international law, but also the valid restrictions in international law, which must be there in place. Freedom of expression can be restricted, but not in the way usually or quite often done in South Asian countries, unfortunately, where in governments in South Asia sometimes actually repress the types of speech which should not be repressed under international law and don't protect those who need to be protected, minorities usually.
Well, definitely. You're absolutely right, Dr. Fernandez. Well, my next question is, as a consequences of the loss of autonomy and imposition of direct authority by the Indian government, the people of Jammu and Kashmir no longer have their own government and no longer have the power to establish and change laws in the area to ensure the protection of their rights as minorities. Well, what kind of legislation should be utilized to bring this problem problem to light and rectify it?
Thank you very much. That is a very complex issue, but as you may know, myself and a number of colleagues, special rapporteurs, have raised the issue of the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir, the revocation, if you will, of the autonomy there. And we've raised a number of concerns in the sense that it would, as is indicated in the communication that we issued in relation to the situation to the government of India, we expressed concerns that the removal of autonomy has a negative impact, or actually discriminates against particularly members of minorities, Muslim minorities that are concentrated in Jammu and actually constitute the majority there. We expressed concerns in terms of land ownership and property ownership in Jammu and Kashmir, because autonomy, without suggesting what kind of autonomy should be in that area, in that region, autonomy is, I think, clearly a form of government which allows minorities to exercise sometimes a significant or some degree of political control and control over their own affairs for minorities that are concentrated in a particular region. Without actually saying specifically what should be the kind of legislation or autonomy for that area, let me say that we expressed, I think, clearly that what has occurred seems to actually, if you will, diminish the political participation of Muslim and Kashmiri minorities by taking away a form of government that actually allowed them to exercise control over their own affairs. And therefore, that has to be looked at. We haven't made any specific recommendation. I'm not able to make one here today either. That would be a bit premature for me to do that. But what we did express is that it seems unreasonable, and I would even venture that it seems to be discriminatory to revoke the autonomy of one of the only regions in India where particularly the Muslim Kashmiri minorities were able to exercise a degree of control over their own political and other affairs.
Well, really, sir, I appreciated your thoughts. Next question. How would you classify which nation activists are more insecure, protected, unsafe because of the prevalent use of violence against minorities? Rights activists in the South Asia region, what steps should they take to protect minority rights activists? What further might the international communities have done to safeguard South Asia's persecuted minorities, in your opinion?
Around the world, we seem to be going, and I think we have to understand there seems to be a pattern here. I think we have to be honest. Human rights around the world are being challenged. I think we are facing an environment, including a political environment in many parts of the world, including Europe, and sometimes we could even suggest some parts of North America or South America, where human rights defenders, and perhaps especially the human rights defenders for minorities, are facing reprisals for trying to defend the human rights of those who are most vulnerable and marginalized. It's a very disconcerting development, but I think we have to look at the longer term, and we have to resist it. In other words, throughout history, you have cycles, situations that get worse before they get better, then sometimes may get worse again. I think we are going through a very difficult, very painful cycle in terms of what we understand as the global human rights system. Human rights are being denied in many parts of the world. Minorities especially are being attacked, ostracized, demonized, shown as not deserving certain claim to be not deserving to have their human rights protected. What the United Nations should be doing, what governments who believe in human rights should be fighting for, and what members of civil society must continue to defend at all costs are human rights, universal human rights for everyone. Yes, this is a difficult period, but there's no other choice. We have to defend those who cannot defend themselves, even though we're going through a very difficult period, obviously.
Well, Dr. Fernandon, in your speech to the United Nations Assembly, you stated that, among other concerns affecting minorities throughout the world, you could focus on the subject of statelessness. Why do you believe that statelessness is such a serious issue for minorities?
Thank you very much for that question. Statelessness is a minority issue around the world. And what I mean by that is that the vast majority, overwhelmingly, those who have no citizenship, those who are stateless, are members of minorities. And in fact, they tend to be members of a relatively small number of minority groups. The best way to understand this is with a number of figures of numbers. Around the world, there's approximately, we don't have extremely precise data, but approximately more than 10 million people who are stateless around the world. More than 3/4 of that 10 million are members of minorities, only a few. In Asia, in all of Asia, the largest number of stateless people are the Rohingya of Myanmar. They're around 1 million. The largest number of the stateless people in the Americas, North and South, are Dominicans, people from the Dominican Republic, Dominicans of Haitian descent, or whose ancestors were from Haiti. They're about 250,000. In Europe, the largest number of individuals who have no citizenship are members of the Russian-speaking minorities in Estonia and Latvia. They're about 300,000. So a small number of minority groups around the world represent the vast majority, overwhelmingly almost all of the stateless people in the world. And that's because you have legislation that actually discriminates intentionally on specific minorities. The Rohingya have no citizenship in Myanmar, not because of an accident, but because of legislation and policies that intentionally denied them citizenship, which they enjoyed actually before the 1980s. So this is why it's a minority issue. Most minorities are stateless. They have no citizenship because governments actually eliminated or denied them citizenship because they belong to a particular minority.
Well, moving forward to the next question. Hate speech and instruments to hatred have grown in popularity in South Asia, with significant consequences for religious, ethnic, linguistic, and gender minorities. Major regional organizations have a long history of openly employing hostile speech, often by top leaders, to spread and reinforce stereotypes and prejudice against minorities. Well, new options provided by digital technology, notably television and social media platforms, have been successfully utilized for this aim. What are the available techniques, instruments, and strategies to deal with these challenges, especially in the term of the solution space?
Thank you very much. I think we need to address this globally. Everything you pointed out is true, but I want to emphasize that this is happening around the world also. That we have a phenomenon where, first of all, the platforms, social media platforms, are profiting through hate. Their business model actually tends to exaggerate, if you will, biases, even prejudices. And therefore, we have to acknowledge that you have a handful, a very small number of companies controlling most of these social media, and they're making money, they're profiting. Their business model actually profits from the propagation of ideas of racial superiority, of intolerance against certain groups, particularly minorities around the world. Most countries haven't dealt with that yet. You have, as you know, most of the social media platforms are based in the United States. What most people don't seem to realize is that these social media platforms actually have a degree of immunity. They cannot be sued, even though they propagate hate and might actually be used to organize even genocides. We have had calls to genocide being spread in social media. What needs to be done? I think we need to address this as a global threat and with a global response, which means an international treaty, legally binding document that tells government what they must do to protect and try to address social hate speech in social media, and also incitement to violence, and even calls to commit atrocities, massacres, even calling for violence against women is occurring, as you may know, as you do know, with almost impunity through social media. Many governments are not doing enough. So how do we show governments what to do? We need a legal document. We need a clarification of their obligations. And also, I think this is the only way we can actually make sure that social media do not always benefit from hate through their platforms, by indicating that they have responsibilities, but also liabilities that will actually be made to pay. Where, they have to pay where it hurts. They have to pay fines and other means if they do not do the right thing. And right now, they're having a situation where it's carte blanche almost, meaning that they can act with a degree of impunity, which can only be addressed by trying to find the instrument, the legally binding approach mechanisms that tell states what they can do and tell them also what they cannot do in terms of restricting freedom of expression, and what they must do to protect those who cannot protect themselves, once again, usually minorities and other vulnerable groups.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fernandez, for such a tremendous recommendation. Well, I always thought that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Well, moving forward to the next question, what are your thoughts on aligning legal, economical, and political framework with minorities, communities, mainstreaming, and as well as arrogating many discrimination and retrogressive implemented to their rights, protection, and promotions?
Thank you very much. There are a lot of elements in that question. In my next report to the United Nations General Assembly in October, in a few months, I'm dealing with the issue of minority social and economic participation and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which the United Nations have established as a priority for the next few years. And I point out that, unfortunately, in the way the SDGs are drafted, there's almost no mention, there's almost no focus whatsoever on minorities. And yet, as my report will show, minorities around the world are those who are often the most excluded, the most disadvantaged in terms of economic participation and even political participation, because sometimes minorities actually may not have the right to vote, or they might enjoy autonomy, and all of a sudden they lose the autonomy, as we've seen in India, in Jammu and Kashmir. So what this report will be, and in the area of development also, it's unfortunately very often the case that indigenous peoples and minorities are not allowed to participate equally in development projects and initiatives, even when these development initiatives occur in their own region. There are serious problems that I've identified that. And amongst the solutions, if you will, that I point out, I indicated that the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and the policy, if you will, of leaving no one behind, has to focus more on those that are often left behind, and these are minorities. And I actually point out that unfortunately, the UN SDGs does not really talk about minorities. It refers to migrants, to people with disabilities, to women, to children, to youth, to indigenous peoples, but not to minorities. So I can't go into all of the details of my report because it hasn't been made public. But unfortunately, we have a situation where there is one group that seems to be left behind, even by the United Nations focus on sustainable development, and that group are minorities. That should be one of the priority groups, and it's not. So we need, and I will be elaborating on a number of recommendations to try to address that. Because if you don't focus on those who are often left behind, you're leaving them behind even more. And this is happening, unfortunately, in many countries in South Asia, or in the region of South Asia, with minorities such as the Dalits, for example, who are still being left behind too much, even increasingly so, I would even suggest to you. So this is one of the areas that this is how we address the leaving behind of minorities in terms of economic participation, in terms of political presence also, by focusing on those that need the most effort to ensure that their equal rights are enjoyed. And so this is it sounds very general, but this is one of the areas where we need to actually make sure that we integrate clearly the human rights of minorities, as we do, for example, with the human rights of women, where there's a lot of efforts and success being done. There's a lot more that needs to be done. But this is how you need to do it, the approach. That in the same way that you try to highlight and integrate and ensure that the rights of women are fully protected and recognized, you have to focus on women's issues. This has not yet been done with minorities, unfortunately. This is where a lot more work has to be done.
You're absolutely right, Dr. Fernandez. Well, according to John Trudell, we cannot change the political system. We cannot change the economic system. We cannot change the social system until the people control the land, and then we take it out of the hand that stick minorities that choose to prevent the meaning and the intention of humanity. Well, moving forward to the next question, COVID-19 is fair to Varennes the already challenging situation for minorities in South Asia. As some governments in the regions use disputations, languages, and rush the crucial civil freedom, what are your opinions on this subject?
We have seen, and this is clear in many parts of the world, we have seen situations where minorities and indigenous people, for example, do not have equal access to information campaign, in fact, on what measures should be taken, how they can protect themselves, or even equal access to vaccines or other protective measures and support programs that the government may have. You may have heard of situations where Dalits are, for example, excluded from access to certain areas, certain clinics even, because they are members of Dalit communities. You may also have heard that there's a problem with some of the government campaigns in some countries, where the government campaigns actually do not target necessarily the minority communities that need to be targeted, and do not use campaigns that with material in their own languages in some countries also. So on one hand, there is the issue of equal access and fair access to the measures in place to protect populations. Minorities can be excluded or disadvantaged for a number of reasons. On the second hand, or the other hand, you have situations where minorities are blamed. Minorities in some countries, and this, as you know, is occurring, unfortunately, in some parts of South Asia, where certain minorities, including, as you know, Muslims in some parts of India, are being blamed for falsely blamed for spreading the virus. And so what you are seeing is a scapegoating of minorities also occurring during this period, that certain minorities are said not to respect the various measures, sanitary measures, to avoid the propagation, the spread of the virus, or even in some cases that minorities are blamed for spreading the virus, either intentionally or other means. And therefore, we have a situation where, because of the pandemic, there's a rise of intolerance and hatred against certain minorities who are even physically attacked for all of these reasons of prejudices and scapegoating and whatnot. So, to use a colloquial expression, it's a double whammy. Some minorities are being hit from different directions twice. First, because they may not have equal access and treatment in terms of protection against the virus. And then secondly, they're being blamed and physically attacked in some cases because of a virus, of false rumors that they're spreading the virus and so on. This is not unique to South Asia, by the way. As you may know, in the United States and in Canada and in some parts of Europe, there's a lot of anti-Asian violence and hatred that is connected to the pandemic because of the mistaken belief that the virus, the COVID, is Chinese, essentially. So if you look Asian, that means you're to blame for the virus. And that has led to violence, a lot of violence, in fact, and hate speech and targeting of Asian minorities in North America and in Europe. So it's a situation where, unfortunately, uncertainty in the future and fear actually leads to violence and attacks even against some minorities, as I described.
Well, Dr. Fernandez, when we talk about minorities are facing lots of persecution and discrimination. Well, please offer some examples of effective practices for minorities protection that government might embrace and implement.
Thank you very much. Some governments actually focus on those who are most vulnerable during the pandemic, and that's extremely important. An easy example, and then I'll elaborate. We all know that the virus actually has tended to target those who are much older and who may have some other medical problems. That's appropriate. You focus first on those who are most threatened or vulnerable to protect them. There are communities, minorities, for example, indigenous minorities in Canada and the United States, who, because of factors such as poverty or lack of access to medical clinics within their communities that can sometimes be isolated. So poverty, sometimes even not having easy access to running water or other health services. All of that means that you sometimes have certain minority communities that are more vulnerable. I think we're well, and I'll speak about Canada as I'm based in Canada right now. The Canadian government actually decided to focus and gave priority to efforts to protect and vaccinate older populations, but also minority indigenous communities that were deemed to be most vulnerable. They also targeted certain immigrant communities who perhaps were more vulnerable because they, once again, were in an economically more unfavorable situation. They were poorer, and they were perhaps living in much more restricted conditions. In other words, bigger families living in smaller houses. It's much more difficult to protect yourself and keep social distancing and whatnot. So one of the measures that the government did was to start an information campaign targeting the indigenous and immigrant communities that were thought to be more vulnerable in their own language, and providing this information in their own language, having outreach activities. In other words, having social workers, social service workers who speak their language or who are members of their community to actually contact them, to try to approach them and inform them on what they should do and how they should protect themselves. So there is the good practice here is to focus on those who are the most vulnerable. And that means in the case of minorities, to focus on them, to reach them in their own language, to reach them in their own communities as much as possible. To some degree, this has also been done, not in all European countries, but in some European countries, on focusing on the Roma who can sometimes live in areas where they have no easy access to running water and live in very poor conditions. You have to focus on them because those are the conditions where it might be more difficult to protect yourself.
Well, moving forward, as minorities have faced growing discrimination and persecution in recent areas, do you believe that a regional structure such as a platform or commission is required to minority and complex governments to adopt human rights measures in order to control, overcome this menace?
I think it's thank you very much. I think it's always a good approach to try to have in place practices and procedures or processes that better recognize and address the most vulnerable segments of society. In other words, if you have mechanisms that are in place, such as a minority commission to protect minorities, that is a very desirable outcome. It's not sufficient. You need a lot more, particularly when you have minorities that may suffer marginalization or are particularly vulnerable in the country. But in the same way as we, in many countries, there are, for example, national commissions to protect the rights of women. There ought to be also, and many other types of mechanisms to try to better protect women. Minorities may, in many countries, be marginalized, be vulnerable, and therefore you need to highlight that and focus with minority commissions. Yes, that's one way. What is important is legislation protecting the rights of minorities, protecting, for example, in the case of linguistic minorities or ethnic minorities, the right, and sets out how these minorities can receive education in their own language, whilst also learning fluently the official language, and so on. So you need more than just a commission. You need other mechanisms, legislation, measures to make sure that the voice of minorities are heard at the national and regional levels, but also that their human rights are specifically recognized so that they may have better tools and mechanisms to protect themselves because of their specific vulnerability and marginalization.
Oh, well, sir, really, I'm very impressed, and truly, you are doing tremendous work. And yes, last but not the least, question is, what is the most important piece of advice you could provide to the new academics as a professor?
I think it is important to follow your heart in what you're doing. In the areas of university or academics, university professors and academics have a great deal to contribute in better understanding and defending also the rights of those who need the most be defended. And I would urge you to focus in areas where you feel you can make a contribution, where you actually feel that there is something that needs to be done and you can actually perhaps help a great deal. Never consider yourselves to be better than the people you are trying to work with and help. They often understand their own problems better. They may not be able to express it in a very scientific language, but I think there's so much to be done around the world today to better protect and work with communities and individuals that need our assistance, that I would urge you and invite you to look into what you think you feel you might be able to contribute, and to work in that direction, because the world definitely
Well, Dr. Fernandez, really appreciated. In the end, I want to say that many communities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and civilization have been assailed by others, and we must go forward. We cannot remain that the position of blame of identical. Instead, we must educate our society that minorities' rights, also known as the human rights, are fundamental rights that all of us have simply because we all are human beings. These rights give us power and enable us to speak up and challenges government maintainers. Well, Dr. Fernandez, thank you so much for giving your precious and valuable time to us. Thank you for sharing your delightful and tremendous thoughts with us. Truly appreciated, sir. Now, Afreen John is signing off for today's interview. Remember me in your prayers. Take care. Goodbye. God bless you all.
Thank you very much and have a good day.